Hunt goes short side. W and run. Now kicks over the top. It'll come down 10 out. Collins was there. Play on. Still the last tackle. Big numbers left. Sloan decides to kick. Here come the Dragons. Here come the Dragons. Oh my goodness. Who writes these scripts? Rugby league. You beautiful thing.
And g'day coaches, this is SuperCoach Corrupt. Thank you for tuning in. Well, today we are going to do a podcast on the anatomy of setting up a pre-season SuperCoach team. What are my thoughts around the strategies behind structuring a SuperCoach team that can hopefully get you off to a really good start by halfway through the season, if not a bit earlier, where you're at the pointy end. So this podcast is going to all be about structuring how many guns to pick here and there and what positions. Not so much about the names of individual players. We will mention a few names, but this isn't going to be that kind of podcast where we're going to go through talking about position by position or team by team. There's stacks of other podcasts out there that wanted to go down that avenue. I really feel that's too early in the season to do that. This is going to be just about how many guns should I be looking for in each position? What are the strategies of setting up a preseason team so that I don't fall into any big traps early on in the season, so I can make the best moves to blast up that ladder and get up to the pointy end, hopefully right at the start of the season or at least by halfway through. So who is Coach Corrupt? Who am I? I've typically been playing SuperCoach for many, many years. I've had several top 1% finishes, and for those that follow me on my socials, particularly on my Twitter, you would have been following my journey last season as I progressed very quickly into the season at a good rank. We started off the season last year at about 28,000 after round one. By approximately round 9, we were 989, so top 1,000 after round 9. And then quickly after that, by round 14, so as the buys had kicked off, we made to the top 100 in 32nd spot. And then by round 16, I was coming 17th overall in SuperCoach. From there, I basically floundered around that 17 to 30th position overall until we got to the end of the season, where I ran out of trades with 3 rounds to go and dropped back to approximately 170th, 178th position overall, where we finished the season. So made the top 1,000, the top 100, the top 20 pretty quickly within the season. I put a large part of that down to how I structured the team at the start of the season. And I've seen a lot of teams sent to me that I'm quite impressed with. And I've seen some teams where I can just see a few little issues that maybe they're going to fall into some traps early on in that season where they may drop behind and maybe not get up to the flyer of a start to the season that they're hoping for. So this is the first of many podcasts this season. If you're into strategy, if you love your SuperCoach, if you want to get some help with your particular team, I'm going to be doing question and answer podcasts. I'll definitely be doing several strategy podcasts regarding trades to be made, moves that can be made, not just player by players. In fact, you won't hear me going through team lists. I won't be doing that on any podcast moving forward. This is no thrills podcast. It's the nuts and bolts of strategy in SuperCoach. I just get straight down and straight into it. We won't be talking through team listing every Tuesday and going through team by team. It's just going to be trades, answering your questions, strategies, and how do we make those big jumps forward. And also, as we progress through the season, we'll be talking a lot about buy planning. We'll be talking about how do we actually structure our teams around those upcoming major, minor buys, and so we can capitalize and also get to the pointy end like we did last season with Coach Corrupt's team. I want that for all of you in 2024. Enough chit chat. Let's get into it. So, structuring a preseason team. I'm not going to lie, there are several ways you can set up your team for SuperCoach come preseason. There's not one way to do it. Let's just get that straight. However, I do think there are several things that you need to consider that I don't hear many people talking about on socials or on podcasts, and I just think it's something you need to consider when it comes to setting up a preseason team. They're things that I put into my team last season that I believe are some of the key reasons that got me off to a really great start, and then also helped me capitalize growing my team's value and moving up that ladder overall very quickly. As I said earlier on, when we talk about this strategy today, what I'm not going to be doing too much of is going through individual names and talking about value in people's names and positions. What I do want to talk to you about is how many people should be putting into each position. How many guns, how many value players we'll be looking for. But as I say at the start, there isn't just one way to set up a team. There's multiple ways you could go about this. This is just my thoughts on what was successful for me last season and what I've seen work over a few years of playing this game. But in saying that, what is really important to understand, coaches, last year was the first real year where we've had these major buys, minor buys, a buy every round. It was a very different season to the years gone before that. So there are some strategic things that you may need to implement into your team just to protect them from lower scoring rounds early on in the season in particular, to help you get off to that better start. So what am I talking about there? Sure, let's get into it. First position, hookers. One of the things that you're going to hear me mention a lot about here is building depth, building particularly backup depth in those second, third, or fourth reserve-based positions. Whenever you have a position where there's only two players to choose from, so hooker's obviously one, you've got halfback, 5'8", fullback, but wherever there's a position where there's only two spots to choose from, I think it's really important that one of those be a solid to gun player. You need to have someone in there that's borderline gun, if not outright gun, like a Nico Hines or a Nathan Cleary, for example. But you do need to have one of them in those two spots. And that sounds pretty obvious. Some people will be listening to this saying, well, yeah, Coach Krupp, that makes sense, right? Like everyone does that. We always have two gun fullbacks, and I always have at least one gun half. I had Nico Hines last season or Nathan Cleary. That's obvious, but it's not so obvious. So with hooker, last season, a lot of people fell into the trap of Brandon Smith and Sonny Luke. So they had that combo. Now that doesn't really fall into that category of having one pure gun or very solid player in the hooker position. And where that took a lot of teams at the start of last season was behind the eight ball because neither of them really fired. Well, we know the Sonny Luke story, unfortunately, and I unfortunately fell into that trap also, having to carry him for a long time. But Brandon Smith hurt a lot of coaches too, especially those that started off with some other hookers that went really, really well, JMK, Harry Grant, for example, all those hookers that were scoring well above what the performance levels of Sonny Luke and Brandon Smith combo were at. So when you've got two positions, you really need to keep that in mind. Do I have one gun at least starting on my squad? That's important, but what's also important, are you looking at the draw? And I'm not saying about have they got an easy run, a hard run in your opinion, because at the start of the season, it is hard to actually pinpoint who's got the easy and who's got the hard runs, because a lot of teams come out focused on defense in particular at the start of the season. So it's very, very hard to go just off last season. But we can definitely draw some information from last season. So, but that's not what I'm talking about here. Have you looked at the draw? Do you know the players that you're choosing when you only have two to choose from, when their buys are going to be falling in the season? It's really, really important on those positions where there's two players. One of the things that I believe set me aside last season to get off to a really good start was I put a lot of thought around the key players I had on my team, having them play as many weeks as I possibly could before they had to hit a bye. What I wanted was, when I'm going to splash the cash, when you're going to choose a large part of your salary cap into gun players, you ideally want those gun players on the field as much as you possibly can. So having them have buys in the early part of the season only sets you back. That's a lot of money you've got sitting on the pine early on in the season. So what I do is I look at the draw and I'll look at that and determine, well, the gun players are going to be putting into these key positions. Which guns are the best guns that I think are going to get me off to the best possible start based on matchups, but also based on the fact that they're not going to be sitting on the pine for a week in those first 6 or 7 weeks of the season. So my question to you is, have you looked at that? Have you looked at those players that you're considering bringing into your team, particularly in those positions where there's only two spots available, and have you considered that? So let's discuss hooker. One of those players that a lot of people are talking about right now is Harry Grant, and for fair reason. Harry Grant is an exceptional player and historically the best hooker for SuperCoach, and it's definitely not a waste of money to go and buy Harry Grant. He's brilliant, and by the end of the season I expect that Harry Grant will be most likely the number one hooker again. But do you need to start with Harry Grant? I'm not saying not to, but I'm also just posing that question, do you need to start with him? Let's have a look into Harry Grant a little bit more. So Harry Grant, on the first 5 rounds of the 2024 season coming up, he will face Penrith, New Zealand, Newcastle, and Broncos. Now that's only 4 teams, because Also in round 4, Melbourne have a bye. So Harry Grant's going to kick off with 4 of the best SuperCoach defensive teams of last season. Those 4 being Penrith, New Zealand, Newcastle and Broncos were extremely good in SuperCoach for defence and giving up points. And also he has a bye in round 4. So my question to you is he the right player to start with? I'm not saying he's not, because as I said at the start, I believe he'll probably be the best SuperCoach averaging hooker in 2024. But could you save yourself $100,000 or $200,000 and maybe look at someone else who potentially will be on the park in round 4, scoring you 50, 60, 70 points, as opposed to using your backup hooker, which for a lot of people are some $200,000-$300,000 hookers who might actually only score you 30 points, maybe 40. That 40-point difference or 30-point difference by having a gun hooker who's not going to be on the bench nor playing for the best defensive SuperCoach teams in the first 5 rounds could be the difference between you getting off to a good start or you getting off to a great start. And that's just in the hooker position. So when we look at teams that have buys after, say, the round 6 or 7, we're talking about teams in SuperCoach such as Raiders, Dragons, Knights, Broncos, Manly, Warriors, Roosters and Cowboys. They're all the teams that are having buys a little bit later. So my question to you is there a hooker in there potentially that you think is going to get you off to a good start, that won't be sitting on the pine, that won't be scoring an average too much lower than what Harry Grant will be when he's playing those tough teams? Is there a chance to pick up Harry Grant after that little hard run at the start and switch across to him from someone else that's not going to be on the pine and also not going to be playing those type of teams at the start? Once again, I'm not going to go specifically into the players' names and go into all of them, because that's something that we can discuss later on as we get closer to actually locking in our teams when the season's about to start and we go through, see some trials and we get some more information. But food for thought. Have a think about that. Have a look at the draws and have a look at buy scheduling as well. This is a different season. Now, you will have heard, and I'll touch on this now, over the years, we've all heard lots of podcasters, lots of social sites out there who have been playing this game also for many, many years, talking about you never sell a gun. Keepers are keepers. You don't play trade roulette with fullbacks or other positions. But last season, if anything, has taught us being a different season. And it's the same season what we're faced with this year. And that is, I believe strongly you can sell guns. You absolutely can and you absolutely should. I sold many guns last season, and some of those decisions absolutely catapulted me up the ladder. When certain guns were about to go on a really tough run of games, or coming up to a bye as well as a tough run of games, and switching across to a different gun, still a gun, but had a really easy run, and historically had a great result against those teams, or that particular teams that they were coming up against that had been offering up a lot of SuperCoach points to that position. That was a good move and well worth of the trade. I don't believe that you have to keep a keeper and that you can't sell keepers. It's just not the case. This is a different type of season. Being fluid and flexible and looking at runs is absolutely critical to you making moves up that ladder. Your starting pre-season team, it doesn't need to be perfect. So don't try to make it absolutely perfect. It doesn't actually matter. What matters is that you don't have too many holes in your team. You need to have the team structure that will allow you to adapt and move once more information is obtained through the first couple of rounds of the season and onwards. Once we get that information, we can then make the moves. We can make the trades, we can get a boost, we can absolutely go for it. We also got an extra week or two before prices go up with regards to the teams that already have a buy early on in the season. They will be a week later before their prices go up. So we've got time to make moves. We don't have to be perfect from day one or from pre-season, but we do need to try and make sure that we have as little damage going to hit our teams as possible by possibly taking on some of this advice around how to structure that team, getting the anatomy of your SuperCoach pre-season team set up strong to minimize the downfalls or pitfalls that could come round 2 or 3 for those that haven't thought of this, who might have a Harry Grant in their team possibly and be looking at their team after first 5 rounds and have wasted basically $200,000 because they could have got the same result by choosing a different hooker that maybe averaged 5-10 points less than Harry Grant, but didn't also have a bye come round 4 in the season. So that's the hooker position. Another thing you're going to hear me say a lot and talk about is trades. So with trades, there's, again, some social sites out there and podcasts and some players that like to talk about saving trades and how important. In fact, some of them go as far as bragging about how they've saved trades, and anyone that didn't save trades doesn't know how to play Supercoach. Well, you know what? They were way down in the rankings compared to a lot of people that didn't take that strategy. And if you want some proof on that, well, I've just given you mine history for last season, and I burned up all my trades with 3 rounds to go and still finished in 178th spot, I think it was, for last season. So that was a really good result. The guy who won the whole Supercomp. He ran out of trades weeks and weeks before the season finished, and he won the whole thing. The guy who was coming first for pretty much the whole Supercoach season also, and then died right at the end based on some factors in and out of his control, but he also ran out of trades with weeks and weeks to go and still finished almost in first position. So my point is, don't always listen to that advice of saving trades is the only way to go, and you have to save your trades, and don't go burning them early. Make sure you've got them for this round or that round. And you know what? Rubbish. You don't actually have to do that. What you have to do is make sure you got your team structure set up right to minimize the need for repair, or you've got the ability to be flexible with your team because you've set it up correctly when you start to gain all this information. I'm a big believer in getting your team set up as quick as you can to build as much depth as you can. What your goal is, if your pre-season team, to set it up, what you want to happen here is you want to build up as much money in your team as quickly as you can so that you can afford backup players who are going to be averaging you good, strong points as early as you can. Whilst other teams who haven't set it up in that way will be relying on their second string hooker or their possibly second string 5'8", or their second string halfback if they've gone for a weaker second string halfback, or whatever the other positions are where they've gone for a weaker option and they haven't planned around buys and other factors. They're going to have to rely on that $200,000, $300,000 player as their starting player for that round. Whereas if you've structured your team correctly, you should be able to avoid most of that damage. And all it takes is looking at your buy schedules, but also, absolutely, I'm a believer in going through your boosts and going through your trades and going through them as much as you need to, within reason, just to set your team up, to build as much depth and as much value in your team so that you can absolutely strengthen your backup positions as quickly as you possibly can. It is a race to who has the strongest team or who can get the strongest team on the park as quick as they can. And then making those minor little niche adjustments to your team to absolutely pick up on the runs that teams have coming up once we know how teams are performing when the season starts to settle down a little bit more come mid-season, and we can see a bit better and clearer who are the gun players for and what positions or what sort of teams are actually leaking the most to certain positions in Supercoach, so we can pick up those players on those runs, and who defensively are limiting players, and we can avoid some gun players or jump off some gun players there and jump on some other players, so we can make those niche moves to actually jump up the ladder, and we keep working through this. And I'm going to help you with that. On these podcasts, I'm going to walk you through that as well on a week-to-week or on a fortnight-by-fortnight basis. Whenever there is a need to discuss this with you, some moves that need to be made, I'm going to be there trying to help you guys. I want all the people listening to this podcast, all the coaches out there listening to this podcast, to have a cracking 2024, to be up that pointy end of the season. Because I tell you now, Supercoach is way more fun up the pointy end of the comp than it is down the bottom of the comp. So those podcasters and social sites and just players out there that say you must save trades, that's all lovely. And it was definitely the way I would say that game was played 3 years ago and earlier. But things have changed. This game has changed with the way that the NRL is structured with an odd amount of teams, major buys, minor buys. And I'm going to walk you through that come buy time of the year as well. But absolutely, feel free to burn through your trades and your boosts. But you do also need to find spots in the season to save. But early on is not the time. Get your team set up, build the depth, upgrade your reserve players so that you actually have strong players filling in for those ones at risk when they're on buys. We need to get a strong team on the park as soon as we can. Moving forward, that was hooker position. So let's go through now to the next position, front rowers. Let's discuss front rowers. What do I think is the right setup in front rowers? Last season, a lot of people decided to go cheap in front row. Christian Welsh, about that $400,000 mark, and they went cheap there, cheap to mid, I should say. With that decision, it set them back a bit from those that started with a Payne Haas, for example. putting on the board 20 to 30 points extra every single week really catapulted those teams up the ladder. I started with Payne Haas last season because I wanted those concrete points in the bank in the front row. I didn't want to be wasting trades, ideally in the front row. It's a position where you can, if you choose the right player, lock them in for a good chunk of that season until buys and origin and things come around, and get off to a great start over and above what some of the other teams are that are starting with a Christian Welch last season or whoever it may be this season. And there's a few names I'm seeing and hearing get thrown around for that, and they're all in that mid kind of price range. So again, not going through player names in this particular podcast, but my thoughts and my planning around front row is start with one gun front row forward. And if you're not going to go with an absolute outright gun, at least choose a super solid front row forward that ideally might cost you around, I don't know, let's just say the $550, maybe $600,000 mark. Someone that allows you to jump a big jump up to a Payne Haas or an AFB or a Tino or whoever that person might be come a few rounds into the season if they absolutely are going off. It's a lot easier to make that jump at 100,000 than what it is at 300 or 400,000 if you start only with $350 to $400,000 players. You want that ability to be flexible. You don't want to fall into that trap where you go, I can't make that move. It's too big a jump. I can't turn my $350,000 player into a Payne Haas. Where am I going to find $400,000 from? So it's a lot easier though to find 100,000, to go from the 550 or 600,000 player up to the 100,000 more, 700, 750,000. So I believe you need to have at least one strong player in your front row forward. The rest is up to you. Definitely, I would recommend having a mid as the second option, but there are other ways you could structure it. And your backup to front row forwards, look, you definitely want to have at least one of those there that's playable. One of them needs to be playable because the chances are that you're going to possibly choose one of your front row forwards that might have a buy early. My recommendation, like I said earlier, is have a look at that. Have a look at your two front row forwards you're choosing. Forget about injuries because that's unknown. But what is known, the information we do know, is we do know the scheduling for next season. So we know when these teams are having buys. So we can plan now and structure our team now to make sure that we are putting players in there that are going to play enough rounds to allow us to build up enough value in our teams to upgrade them or our backup front row forwards to a better player who can fill in when they do go on their buy. So we're not having to play a $200,000, $300,000 front row forward because we didn't plan really well in the preseason. So let's plan that. Let's have a little bit of a look in our own time around what are the front row forwards that possibly we could choose that will get the best bang for buck out of, the ones that are going to play the most games before we can then upgrade them into somebody else or our reserve front row forwards into somebody else. So my advice, at least one semi-gun to gun, a mid, and the reserves there are typically going to be some cheaper guys, but you need one of them to be someone that is definitely playable. You don't want to be dropping down to a 20 or 30 point scorer. You ideally want to have someone that can possibly pump you out a 45 to 55 mark on their day. So that's the setup for front row forward that I believe is the best structure. Moving on to second row forwards. Now here it's a little bit different because in second row forward we have 6 people to choose from. So there's a lot of ways you can play the second row forward. I just feel this year with the amount of outright guns that you're going to want to bring into your team that possibly second row forward is not the right spot to go spending up a huge amount of cash on one particular or two particular players. But you still could. I just don't feel that's the right structure. So my thoughts in second row forward are, I feel like the mid to just above mid range is the right mark for your starting 3 players on second row forwards. Again, not going to go through too many names, but we're all hearing them get thrown up, and we've all hopefully done a bit of research and looked into them as well. So people like a Sean Lane or a Firma, and there's others as well. So you've got people out there that fit into this category who aren't going to be the top averaging second row forwards, but will get a job done for us, whilst we use that saving in cash to splash it elsewhere in our team. And with our backups, we definitely need to have one, if not 2 of them that are playable due to injuries, buys, suspensions, all that kind of stuff. We want to have at least 1, ideally 2, in that second row forward that we could rely on. The 5th or 6th second row forward, generally we want to save money there because we just want cash generation. We're never going to play this person. We just want cash gen. And if you're just after cash gen, you don't need to, whether you make $100,000 off a $200,000 player or $100,000 off a $400,000 player, if you're not going to play either of them, you want the $200,000 player. Because he's going to turn into 300, and either way you're making $100,000. but you're not wasting an extra $200,000 of your salary cap by getting that $400,000 player if you're not intending on playing them. So have a look at what your intentions are and who you're going to play. Is there another option that can make you the same kind of money that's a little bit cheaper if you're not intending on playing them? Something for you just to look at as well when you're choosing your players. Halfbacks. This is an area where last season they absolutely went off. We had some huge scores, massive scores, and we had a luxury of choices last season as well. And we're possibly faced with the same thing again this season. So how do you structure halfback? You definitely want at least one gun halfback. Absolute standout gun. Now, I could mention names, but there's no point. There's really only two standout absolute options here. You've got Nico Hines and Nathan Cleary. They are your two standout options. Who you go for as your number one standout gun choice, that's up to you. I don't mind. Go with whatever your gut says. There are some factors in there that I would definitely throw at you to consider, but go with what your gut says and what your research says is going to have the better start to the season and who you think is going to capitalize more on their runner games at the start with their draws and all the other factors that we've discussed in this podcast so far. But that is a position with two options. Now, you're going to have some teams out there set up with two guns in those positions, and I'm not against that either. And for this particular position, you've got two standout players that have huge high ceilings, some of the highest in SuperCoach. So to start, if you've got the money and you can splash the cash in that position, it's absolutely not a bad strategy. In fact, it's great if you've got the money to do it. However, not all of us are going to have that money due to some other positions that we're loading up in. So it's up to you, but you definitely want to have at least one. And whoever that one is, once again, you need to make sure of their buy scheduling. And their run to a degree, but definitely their buy scheduling. So are you choosing a player that is going to have a buy in the first 4 or 5 rounds before you've had a chance to upgrade that second player that wasn't a gun? Now, in this particular case, we're talking about the Sharks. They have a buy in round 5. So that's fairly early, and Penrith the week after in round 6. So just something to consider. How are you going to structure your team around that with that in mind as well? 5/8. In this particular position, I think we can save a little bit of money, and I've generally always structured it with one gun, one cheapie. Ideally, a dual, if I can put a dual in there, but that information probably won't come to hand until we start the season or till the season kicks off and we get some more information about where players are going to be playing and hopefully some duals get added into the game prior to launch. But at the moment, typically one gun and one cheapie that you're going to make some money off is ideal. So that's a risk. If we're only going to be putting in one gun and we've only got 2 positions to choose from, you're going to want to make sure that gun is going to play a fair whack of the season at the start before we can build up enough money in our team to upgrade that second 5/8 position to someone that we're comfortable in playing when that first gun has a bye. So have a look at the draw or rewind this podcast back to when I went through those teams that are on buys after about round 7 onwards and have a look to see what 5/8s in there you feel are going to match the design and structure of your team. But there's definitely some options. Wings and centers. We've got 7 wing centers that we could choose to put in our teams. My advice here is a bit similar to the front row forward position when we discussed it. I'd like to start in this position at least with one gun or one player that is up there in value, who I see as someone that's going to have a good start, who's not going to play the buys early, someone that I feel I can make some money off, but definitely I believe is going to get off to a flying start as a center wing, who have huge ceilings, massive ceilings. Now, the reason I say that for is because if you get it wrong, to minimize the damage, we want that ability as well, ideally, to be able to make the switch. So let's say, without talking absolute specifics about who's going to be in your team and who should be in your team, but let's just pick a name, the dearest centre wing we've got. Let's say it's Greg Marju. Greg Marju currently at $789,000. You put him into your team, hypothetically, and let's say he doesn't get off to a good start. He actually is going to lose your money because he's had only a mediocre start. He got pumped out some 50s, but those 50s are probably better than most of your other centre wings and most of the other ones that other teams are playing. You haven't lost any cash yet because it's the first 2 rounds, but hypothetically, on the other hand, let's say Ruben Garrick gets off to a flyer at $722,000. You can make the switch come round 2 or 3 if you feel that is going to be how he averages moving forward. You can make that switch. It's a lot harder to make that switch to, let's say, again, Ruben Garrick's going off at $722,000 if your team's full of $300,000 centre wingers and you've just gone cheap there and loaded up the pack. If you've just gone cheap in the centre wings, it makes it really hard to make that jump. that 300,000-400,000 is really hard to find. You're probably downgrading a Harry Grant or a Payne Haas, but then that puts the whole team into a disbalance. And an unbalanced team can often drop you down the ladder because it's hard to fix all the holes that creates. So it's really good to put a bit more thought at the start of it. How am I going to protect myself if some things don't go the way I think they're going to go? And that's where a bit of thought around the value of players as well as who the players are is important, as well as the buy scheduling too. So my advice there is start with someone that is at least of decent value to a good, strong gun in there. And that gives you options, downgradable options, moving sideways options. It gives you flexibility within your team. The other 3 starting positions, look, as we get more information come trials and as we get more information before the season starts on team lists and starting roles of particular players, we'll have a bit clearer understanding of what players here to target. I could definitely throw at you bunches of names, but again, it's not what this podcast is for. What I would suggest in this position is look at your mid to cheapies in the rest of the positions. I'm not just talking $200,000 cheapies. I'm talking more around that 300 to 400 range, maybe a mid 200 in there as well. And then on your reserve bench for your center wings, keeping that relatively cheap to bottom price to save some dollars in there. But that's going to depend on Team List Tuesday. It's going to depend on trials, injuries, and a whole lot of other information, which is why I don't want to go through here team by teams, position by position analysis, because it's all going to change. Things will happen. There will be injuries. There'll probably be some suspensions before the season starts. Things are going to happen. So I'm just going to hold off on that and just say to you, leave those other 3 spots for players that are going to make you money, because you're probably not going to play a 5th, 6th, or 7th center winger in your team to start off with in the preseason, well, the first couple of rounds of the season. So just save money there, but you definitely want to have players that are starting and players that can make you money. Ideally, you do want one of those 3 reserves, though, as someone that's playable, definitely playable, because again, you're going to have to be very lucky not to have any of your starting 4 center wings not on an early buy or something to happen to them. So you want to have at least one of your backup 3 center wings as someone that's definitely playable early. But main thing there, save money, splash the cash elsewhere. Fullbacks. I love fullbacks. Oh, this is Coach Krupp's weakness, fullbacks, because they have a huge ceiling, massive ceiling. Fullbacks are awesome. Last season, I played fullback roulette many times throughout the season, bringing in players, removing players from fullback, and it absolutely made a huge difference to my overall result. When a fullback was about to go on a run or come up against a hard run of games or had buys coming up, and depending on their scheduling or state of origin affected it too, jumping on, jumping off, moving here, moving there. And as I said, it catapulted me up into the top 1,000, top 100, 17th position overall, early to mid throughout that season, when other players are out there thousands, 20, 40, 50,000 positions below where my team was at, trying to, at the back end of the season, hope that they've saved enough trades to maybe jump up within 10,000, 20,000 of where my team and others finished. What I want for you guys listening to this podcast is to be in a position where you can attack, where you can absolutely make a run for it. I'd love to see that my listeners on this podcast are midway through the season up in that top 2,000, maybe even higher, top 1,000, possibly even top 100. I want that for everyone listening to this podcast. But it comes down to just putting a little bit of work and planning and thought behind which players to pick and also where to splash the cash. So let's talk about fullbacks. 2 positions. You definitely, as I've said earlier on, should have at least 1 gun in a fullback. Well, I'll break that rule here. You want 2. You want 2 guns in fullback. Their ceilings are just too high. And you can probably hear in my voice, I absolutely love the fullback position because there's heaps of variety. There's heaps of options. There is way more option as a gun player in this position than any other position in SuperCoach. Players that have 100 plus ceilings everywhere in this fullback spot. So we absolutely want to be splashing the cash here and buying 2 gun players. Who those gun players are is up to you. I'll give you some more information on that, and there's heaps of other avenues for you to gain that information as well come the season kicking off into round 1. But fullback position, you definitely want to splash the cash here. Go for 2 guns. Don't get clever. Don't think this is an opportunity for you to save some money and maybe splash it more up in hooker or front row forward or your Cleary-Hines duo. Like, find a way to make it all work if you can. But 2 fullbacks here is definitely the way to go that are absolute guns. And you've got options. My advice, once again, is have a look at buy scheduling. You've only got 2, and this is a lot of your money. So if you were hypothetically starting with Kalen Ponga, he's almost $900,000. That's a lot of your salary cap gone. And the number 2 option is Drinkwater at $851,000. If you were to start with those guys, you're talking about $1.7 million of your salary cap gone and 2 players. So what you're going to want is a return on that investment. So what you're going to want is those players definitely not having a buy in the first 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks even. You want the ability to get best bang for buck, to get your team off to a flying start. When other players might have, let's say, Ryan Pappenhausen, another really popular option. Ryan Pappenhausen has a really early buy. So he's no different than Harry Grant that we mentioned at the start with a tough draw. First 4 of those 5 rounds are against the best defensive Supercoach teams that we had last year. Penrith, New Zealand, Newcastle, Broncos. But that doesn't mean they'll be the best this season, but we can only go off the data that we have in front of us. So last season, they were. So someone like a Ryan Pappenhausen, who's coming back from, we all know, a really unfortunate, serious injury, we just don't have the runs on the board anymore, except for a couple of years back when we look at Pappenhausen of, not only old, but a few years back, of what he was. We don't have all the information at hand for Pappenhausen at the moment. I'm not saying let's start with him, but more teams than not that I'm seeing have him in their team. And it could be a brilliant option. You've saved yourself possibly a few $100,000 from some of the other guns. And it could be the difference between you getting off to an absolute cracking start and building up depth in reserve positions all through your squad and not. Or maybe it's not that way. Maybe Pappenhausen struggles against those 4 really good Supercoach defensive teams and only puts up average scores. And maybe that buy that the Storm have come round 4 actually hurt those teams that started with him, because another team out there might have, let's say, Latrell Mitchell, or who goes off to an absolute flyer, but he wouldn't be a great option either, because I believe Souths have an early draw. Oh, actually, no, South's draw is in round 7. So kind of that borderline mark that I was talking about. But they do have a few tough games early in the season to Souths. But someone might have got a broader Latrell Mitchell in, or a Reece Walsh, who does have a late draw and also has a pretty good draw and gets off to an absolute flying start. And Reece Walsh sets it on a light, and those teams stuck with Pappenhausen now need to find a couple of $100,000 to make that jump. Again, they've put themselves in a tough spot, in a key position that has huge ceilings. So like I said to you before, the structuring of your team to allow for maneuverability, flexibility, you need to be fluid, is really important. How we structure our teams come pre-season, the anatomy of that team that you create can make or break you. Now, it doesn't ruin the whole season. We can make changes. We've got boosts, we've got trades, we've got stacks of things that we can do. But it's better using that on choosing players that are going to grow the value of our team, or players that, okay, I've got my center wing gun wrong, I'm just going to make a quick, easy switch across, rather than, oh no, crap, I've got to find $400,000. Where am I going to find that from? I'm going to have to use trades, boosts, just to find that $400,000. Well, no, it's easy just to make one trade and make that change across from one gun center to the other who you think, okay, I got that one wrong. This is the player I should have been on. Boom, bring him in. Done. Or fullback, or whoever that position might be. And fullback is a great example as well. There are so many fullbacks that could be the right one to select to start this season. It could be Walsh, it could be Latrell, it could be Drinkwater, it could be Ponga, it could be so many, Pappenhausen, it could be Turbo, who knows? But there's stacks of options there. You want the ability to be able to change easily and not have to find bulk cash. So Pappenhausen, great way to save money, but it possibly could put you in a position where you've now in a spot where you've got to find bulk cash if that doesn't work out for you. And if that happens, and you've also got some other positions, like you didn't start with Payne Haas, and you've got to find $300,000 there, you've got a lot of money early on that you're going to have to try and chase and find, which could affect your starting position, and you could be chasing the tail the whole way through the season and never really get ahead and get in front and get up the pointy end, because the other teams did start with them and they've got off to a flyer and now they're hard to catch and peg back. So I hope that helps. That's in a nutshell, without going specifics into position by position, team by team. That other information is out there in other podcasts, and feel free to listen to those. There's some good information in there, but it's not what this one's about. This is nuts and bolts strategy. My Coach Corrupt podcast moving forward is going to be all about this. I won't be doing team list Tuesdays. I won't be doing that information. I'll be getting in talking about trades and moves that you can make to take your team further up the ladder, whether that be head to head or whether that be overall. I've focused on both over the years, head-to-head and overall, and had good placings. I won my main head-to-head comp. I won that last season as well. So I've strategies around both, and I'll discuss both as we go throughout this season. What I really want from here is if you can jump onto my Twitter page, particularly Twitter. I also have a Facebook page. I'm on TikTok as well. So it's Coach Krupt with a K. What I'd love for you to do is jump on there and ask me some questions. Shoot away some questions that you might have around the structure of teams, or that you might have. If you've got any particular questions around players, sure, go for it. But I'm really more interested about structure of teams at this stage of the season. It's too early to get into picking and locking in an actual team. So jump on my socials, give us a yell or a like and a follow. And from there, we'll be releasing more podcasts as this season kicks off and as we get closer to the launch of this season. So stay tuned to my Twitter page in particular, and you'll be able to see when more of these podcasts drop. Thank you so much for listening to my first strategy podcast of 2024. I'm Coach Krupt. Look forward to seeing you out there, coaches.